She was falling at over 100 miles per hour. No parachute, no pilot, no one to hear her scream. Below her, 2 miles of open sky, a roaring thunderstorm, and the deepest, darkest jungle on the face of the earth. She was 17 years old. She was still wearing her graduation dress, and she was completely alone. On Christmas Eve 1971, a commercial aircraft carrying 92 people disappeared over the Peruvian Amazon. The plane had been torn apart in the sky. Investigators found wreckage scattered across miles of dense rainforest. Rescue teams searched for 10 days. They found nothing. They declared everyone dead. But the jungle was hiding something. Somewhere beneath a canopy of trees so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground, something was still moving. A girl, broken, bleeding, starving, but alive. This is not just the story of a plane crash. This is the story of what one human being is capable of when everything has been taken away. This is the story of Julianne Kupka. And in the decades since, scientists, psychologists, and survival experts have all asked the same question: how did she do it? To understand Christmas Eve 1971, you have to understand who Julianne Kupka was before that day. She was not an ordinary teenager. Born on October 10, 1954 in Lima, Peru, Julianne was the only child of two of the most respected zoologists in South America. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Kupka, was a pioneering biologist. Her mother, Maria Kupka, was a brilliant ornithologist, a scientist who dedicated her life to studying the birds of the Amazon. Together, they were a remarkable couple, and they raised their daughter not in the comfort of a city apartment, but in the wild heart of the Peruvian jungle. When Juliana was 14 years old, her parents uprooted their lives entirely. They moved deep into the Amazon rainforest and established the Panguana Biological Research Station, a remote outpost carved from the jungle, surrounded by rivers, animals, and ancient trees. For years, Juliana grew up there. She learned the sounds of the forest. She learned which plants were dangerous and which were safe. She learned how to navigate rivers and how to read the jungle like a language. She did not know it then, but her parents were giving her something far more valuable than a formal education. They were giving her the tools to survive. In 1971, educational authorities required Juliana to return to Lima to complete her final school examinations. She enrolled at the Deutsche Schule Lima, the German school in the Peruvian capital, and on December 23, 1971, she graduated. The night before the crash, Juliana Kupka stood in a ceremony and received her high school diploma. She celebrated with her mother, Maria. They laughed, they were proud, and they made a plan. They would fly home to Panguana the very next morning, Christmas Eve, to celebrate with Juliana's father. That decision, that single, joyful, completely ordinary decision, would change everything. The Lima airport on the morning of December 24, 1971, was not a peaceful place. The day before, a wave of flight cancellations had stranded hundreds of passengers across the city. Now they were all crowding the terminal at once, families desperate to reach their loved ones for Christmas, businessmen with overdue schedules, and a general atmosphere of anxiety and frustration that filled every corner of the departure hall. Juliana and her mother Maria arrived early. They found chaos. Most flights were still fully booked. One by one, the options disappeared. There was one seat left. One airline with availability on a Christmas Eve flight to Pucallpa with a connection toward Iquitos. The airline was called LANSA, Líneas Aéreas Nacionales Sociedad Anónima. Before they booked the tickets, Juliana's father called. He had one piece of advice, delivered in a quiet but firm voice. He told Maria to avoid LANSA. He knew the airline's reputation. He had heard stories. LANSA was known within aviation circles as one of the most dangerous carriers in South America. Just 3 years earlier, in 1970, Another Lanza aircraft had crashed in the mountains near Cusco. Over 100 people had died. The airline had continued operating. Maria listened to her husband's warning. Then she booked the tickets anyway. She had a daughter who wanted to be home for Christmas. There was no other way. Sometimes love makes decisions that logic cannot stop. At around noon on December 24th, Lanza Flight 508, a Lockheed L-188A Electra turboprop, pushed back from the gate at Lima's Jorge Chavez International Airport. On board were 86 passengers and 6 crew members. 92 lives, all headed toward the jungle. Juliana sat in seat 19F, the window seat. Her mother Maria sat beside her. Juliana was still holding her graduation diploma. The first 30 minutes of the flight were smooth. Passengers received small snacks. Children pointed excitedly at the mountains below. There was quiet conversation, soft Christmas music playing through the cabin speakers. An ordinary flight. But the real story was only beginning. Over the Peruvian Andes, the weather changed without warning. The sky turned black. Not the soft gray black of rain clouds. This was something else. A wall of darkness, dense and alive, rising ahead of the aircraft like a living thing. Inside it, lightning pulsed in white and blue, flickering like a broken electrical current. The turbulence hit first. Bags fell from overhead compartments, drinks spilled, passengers grabbed armrests and each other. People began to scream. Juliana later remembered watching her mother's face in that moment. Maria Kupka, a woman who had spent decades in the Amazon rainforest and had never seemed afraid of anything, looked out the window at what was coming. And she said, very quietly, "Hopefully this goes all right." She already knew. Investigators later determined that the pilots of Lanza Flight 508 had received weather warnings before departure. A massive thunderstorm system was developing along the flight path. The decision to continue, despite those warnings, despite the reports of dangerous conditions ahead, was, according to Peruvian aviation investigators, a product of pressure. Holiday schedule pressure, commercial pressure, the kind of pressure that sometimes pushes pilots into skies they should never enter. At approximately 12:45 in the afternoon, the aircraft entered the storm. And then lightning struck. The bolt hit the right wing. A fire erupted instantly. Structural failure followed within seconds. The right wing separated from the fuselage. Then part of the left wing tore away. The aircraft, still carrying 92 people, began to disintegrate in midair, not on the ground, not near a runway, but at 21,000 feet above the jungle floor, falling apart piece by piece, like a machine being disassembled by invisible hands. Juliana Kupka later described the next few seconds with a stillness that is almost more disturbing than panic would have been. She saw a bright flash of light at the outer engine. She heard her mother's final words, "That is the end. It is all over." And then the aircraft was gone. Juliana was not inside it anymore. She was outside, in the open sky. The cabin had been ripped away from around her. She was still strapped to her seat, still attached to the entire row of 3 seats, and she was tumbling through the air in the middle of a thunderstorm at 10,000 feet above the Amazon rainforest. She looked up at the clouds. She looked down at the broccoli-shaped canopy of trees far below. And then she lost consciousness. Nobody who has fallen 2 miles from a plane has ever survived. That is not hyperbole. That is mathematics. That is physics. That is the reality of what a human body is capable of enduring. A fall from that height, without any protection, without any equipment, onto any surface, it is not survivable. Juliana Kupka survived. Experts spent years trying to understand how. The most widely accepted explanation begins with the seat itself. Juliana was not just strapped into a single seat. She was attached to an entire row of 3 seats. a connected unit that, as it tumbled and spun through the air, may have functioned like a crude, uncontrolled rotor, like a helicopter blade, slowing the descent. Not much, but perhaps enough. The thunderstorm itself may have helped as well. The powerful updrafts inside that storm system, the same violent air currents that tore apart the aircraft, may have created pockets of upward pressure that briefly slowed her fall. And then, at the moment of impact, two more factors aligned. The dense tree canopy of the Amazon acted as a series of layers that absorbed and distributed the force of the fall. And her landing site, by pure chance, was softer ground, leaf-covered, cushioned by years of compressed organic material. She hit the jungle floor at reduced speed, still catastrophic, still devastating, but not fatal. When Julianne opened her eyes, she was lying on her back in the Amazon rainforest, alone. Her collarbone was broken. She had a deep gash in her right arm. Her knee ligament was torn. One eye was swollen nearly shut from the concussion. She had lost one of her shoes. Her glasses were gone. She was in the middle of nowhere on Christmas Eve, surrounded by the sounds of the jungle, insects, birds, running water, and the distant, scattered echoes of falling debris. She called out for her mother. Nobody answered. What Julianne did next is what separates her story from every other aviation disaster in history. She did not wait to be rescued. She understood, in a way that most people, most adults, would not have understood in that moment, that no one was coming, not immediately. The plane had vanished from radar. Investigators would not even know where to begin looking. The jungle was vast. She was a single human being in an area larger than many countries. If she stayed still, she would die. She stood up. Her broken collarbone screamed with pain. Her knee threatened to buckle beneath her. But she stood up, looked around at the trees, and she made a decision that her father had taught her years before at the Panguana Research Station. Follow the water. Rivers always lead to people, settlements, villages, fishermen. All human life in the Amazon tends to gather near water. If she could find a stream, and if she could follow it, it would eventually take her somewhere. She found a small creek and began walking. The jungle is not a place that welcomes visitors. Juliana knew that better than most. The heat during the day was overwhelming, sitting heavy and wet against the skin. At night, the temperature dropped and the sounds changed. The chorus of insects gave way to something darker, something deeper. Predators moved through the undergrowth. Caiman crocodilians rested in the shallows of the rivers she waded through. Every step required a decision. Every branch, every shadow, every unfamiliar sound demanded attention. She walked. On the fourth day, she came across something that stopped her completely. 3 seats from the aircraft had landed in the jungle nearby. The passengers were still strapped into them, buried headfirst into the earth from the impact of the fall. She checked every face carefully, dreading what she might find. It was not her mother. She kept walking. She survived on a small packet of sweets she had found in the crash debris. That was all. One small packet of candy stretched across nearly 2 weeks in one of the most physically demanding environments on the planet. But the real danger was not the hunger. It was her arm. The deep gash had become infected, and into that wound, a botfly had found its way, laid its eggs, and now the eggs had hatched. By the 9th day, Juliana could feel the maggots moving inside the wound. She reached a point where she could not ignore it any longer. Then she remembered something her father had done once, back at the research station, for one of their family's pets. She found a motorized canoe nearby, abandoned by lumberjacks working somewhere upriver. It had a fuel tank. She opened it, took some gasoline, and poured it directly into the wound on her arm. She later said she counted the maggots as they crawled out. There were 35. It was an act of raw, practical, extraordinary courage. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of courage, the quiet kind, the kind that does what needs to be done without ceremony. This was the mistake that changed everything, or rather, the moment that refused to become one. Juliana had reached the edge of what a human body could endure, and instead of stopping, she pushed the edge back. She kept walking. On the 11th day, Juliana Kopka found a small open-air shelter, a simple structure with a palm leaf roof, built by local lumberjacks as a resting camp along the river. It was empty, but it meant something had changed. People had been here. People might come back. She treated her wound further with gasoline from a fuel container she found inside. She lay down on the floor of the hut, exhausted beyond any exhaustion she had ever known, and she waited. Hours passed. She watched tree frogs moving across the walls in the darkness. She was so hungry she considered trying to catch one. She did not have the strength. The following morning, voices. 3 Peruvian lumberjacks returned to their camp. They pushed through the entrance of the hut and stopped immediately. Standing before them was a teenage girl, sunburned, emaciated, covered in insect bites, her arm wrapped in makeshift bandaging, one shoe missing, appearing from the depths of the Amazon rainforest as though she had materialized from the jungle itself. They were afraid of her. Local legend in that region described a water goddess, a spirit of the rivers, who appeared to travelers in the form of a pale woman emerging from the deep forest. For a moment, these men, who had spent their lives in the jungle, who knew its moods and its dangers better than almost anyone, genuinely questioned what they were seeing. Then Juliana spoke to them in Spanish. She said, "I am the girl from the Lanza crash. My name is Juliana." The lumberjacks stared at her. They had heard about the Lanza disaster, the plane from Lima that had disappeared into the storm on Christmas Eve. The search had been called off. There were no survivors. The jungle had taken them all. The men looked at each other. They took her in. They cleaned her wounds as best they could. They gave her food. They poured more gasoline on her arm, a method used in that region for exactly this kind of tropical wound infection. They gave her water. They let her sleep. The next day, they placed her in their canoe and traveled for 11 hours down the river to a more populated area. From there, she was airlifted to a hospital in Pucallpa. Juliana Kopka had survived. What followed was, in many ways, its own kind of ordeal. News of her survival spread across the world within hours. The story was extraordinary, scientifically, statistically, humanly extraordinary. She became famous overnight, a media spectacle. Reporters arrived at the hospital. Cameras captured her pale, bandaged face. The world wanted the story, wanted the details, wanted to understand how a 17-year-old girl had done what no one was supposed to be able to do. But Juliana was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about her mother. Maria Kopka had been sitting right beside her daughter when the aircraft broke apart. Juliana had called for her mother in the jungle and heard nothing. She had checked every body she found and never found Maria's face. Now, from a hospital bed, she asked the question that had been sitting at the center of everything since she first opened her eyes in the rainforest. Had they found her mother? The answer was no. Search teams had been unable to locate Maria in the dense jungle. But Juliana, once she had recovered enough strength, did something that tells you everything you need to know about who she was. She got up. She went back. She assisted the search parties herself, guiding them through the terrain she had walked for 11 days, helping them navigate a jungle that had nearly killed her in search of her mother's remains. Maria Kopka's body was found on January 12, 1972. She had survived the initial fall. She had lived for several days after the crash, but alone, injured, without her daughter's jungle knowledge, she had not been able to walk out. The investigation that followed the crash revealed disturbing conclusions. The pilots of LANSA Flight 508 had made the decision to fly into hazardous weather, despite clear warnings. Investigators cited intentional flight into dangerous conditions as a primary cause of the disaster. The airline, which had already lost a previous aircraft in a fatal crash, had continued operating under pressure to meet schedules, even when safety demanded otherwise. LANSA lost its operating certificate 11 days after the crash. It was the last flight they ever operated. The company ceased to exist. But 91 people were already gone. Decades later, German filmmaker Werner Herzog arrived at Juliane Kupke's door. He had a personal reason for wanting to tell her story. On the morning of December 24, 1971, Herzog himself had been scheduled to board LANSA Flight 508. He was in Peru scouting locations for a film project and had made a last-minute change of plans that moved him to a different flight. He had come within hours of dying alongside everyone on that aircraft. For years, Herzog had wanted to make a documentary about Juliane's survival, but she had withdrawn from public attention, reluctant to revisit the trauma. He spent a long time trying to find a way to reach her. He eventually located her through the priest who had conducted Maria Kupke's funeral service. When they finally met, he asked if she would return to the jungle with him. She said yes. In 1998, 27 years after the crash, Juliane Kupke walked back into the Amazon rainforest with Werner Herzog and a documentary crew. She retraced the path she had walked as a 17-year-old girl, through rivers and undergrowth and heat. She described the experience years later as a kind of therapy, a way of confronting what had happened rather than being quietly haunted by it forever. The documentary, Wings of Hope, remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of film ever made about survival and memory and the strange relationship between trauma and healing. Juliane Kupke went on to become a scientist. She studied biology at the University of Kiel in Germany, graduating in 1980. She earned a doctorate from LMU Munich. She returned to Peru and conducted years of research in mammalogy, specializing in bats. She married a German entomologist. She became the director of the Panguana Research Station, the very place where her parents had first taught her how to survive in the jungle that would one day save her life. In 2011, she published her autobiography, Als ich vom Himmel fiel, When I Fell from the Sky. It won the Corine Literature Prize. In 2019, the government of Peru named her a Grand Officer of the Order of Merit for Distinguished Services. She still lives. She still works. She still returns to the Amazon. But the question that outlasts all of the facts, all of the investigations, all of the scientific analysis, is not how Juliane survived the fall. It is why she kept walking. Survival experts who have studied her case point to one thing above all others: not her jungle knowledge, not the physics of the seat row, not the gasoline treatment for the wound. Those things matter, but the decisive factor was something internal. She never stopped believing she could find a way out. Most people in that situation would have sat down. The pain alone, broken collarbone, torn knee, deep infection, concussion, would have been enough to justify stopping. The isolation would have been enough. The scale of the loss, her mother gone, 91 other people gone, Christmas Eve, alone in the most remote jungle on the planet, any one of those things would have been enough to make a person stop. Juliane did not stop. She later said the thoughts that kept her moving were simple ones. Her father was waiting. He would be looking for her. She had to find a way back to him. She had to keep going. That was it. No dramatic revelation, no spiritual moment, just the quiet, stubborn, extraordinary decision to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Guinness World Records now lists LANSA Flight 508 as the deadliest commercial aviation accident caused by an in-flight lightning strike in history. 91 people were killed. One girl walked out of the jungle. And the reason she walked out was not luck alone. though luck played its part. The reason was that the jungle her parents had built their lives in, the jungle she had grown up learning and respecting and understanding, gave her something that no textbook and no classroom ever could. It gave her a reason not to be afraid of it. There is one last detail about this story that most people never mention. When those 3 lumberjacks found Juliana in the hut by the river, shaking and wounded and barely able to stand, one of them knelt down in front of her before he even thought to ask who she was or where she had come from. He simply wanted to make sure she was real. He had been in the Amazon his entire life. He had seen things there that most people would never believe. He had learned to understand the jungle as a place of both beauty and absolute indifference, a place that did not care whether you lived or died, a place that simply continued season after season, regardless of what happened inside it. He had never seen anything like this. A girl, alone, alive, emerging from 10 days of jungle that would have broken a trained survival expert. He knelt in front of her, and he looked at her face, and he asked one question. She answered him in Spanish, and in that moment, in a small wooden hut beside an unnamed river deep in the Peruvian Amazon, the most impossible survival story of the 20th century quietly came to an end. The jungle had given her back.